It is difficult to convey an idea of the silence of the fields through which I passed, or the beauty of the prospect that surrounded me. A blue sky without a cloud across it, a sea sparkling under a haze of heat, wildflowers in profusion around me, poppies predominating everywhere. In that red-roofed town, the centre of all that was fashionable and select, there was not a bed to be had for love or money. All home comforts, all conveniences to which well-bred people had been inured were deliberately sacrificed for the sake of a lodging amongst a little society that loved its band, its pier, its shingle and its sea. Custom had established a certain rule at this pretty little watering place, and it was religiously obeyed. It was the rule to go on the sands during the morning, to walk on one cliff for a mile in the afternoon, to take another mile in the opposite direction at sunset, and to crowd upon the little pier at night.
So read the Daily Telegraph of the 30th of August, 1883. The column was by Clement Scott, doyen of the Victorian travel writers and theatre critics. He was speaking of Cromer. Scott had arrived in the town earlier that month on the Great Eastern Railway. The railway company could expect that a good article by Scott in the Telegraph would lead to many people wishing to use their service to visit a town which had previously been very select, though difficult to reach. Scott had arrived in Cromer at the recently built High Station, not the station where the rail traveller arrives today, but one with a view looking down the best part of a mile into the town. Unfortunately, he said, he couldn't find anywhere to stay. Undaunted, he set out to find lodgings.
I turned my back on what was perhaps the prettiest watering place of the East Coast and walked along the cliffs. At a mile removed from the seaside town I had left, I did not find a human being. There they all were below me, as I rested among the fern on Lighthouse Cliff, digging on the sands, playing lawn tennis, working, reading, flirting and donkey riding.
Perhaps if Cromer had been able to offer a bed for the night, his article would have been written there. The train caught back to London the next day, and Poppyland never created. As it was, he walked on, passing by fields full of rich red poppies amongst the corn.
I strolled on and cut through the cornfields towards a cluster of farms and a deserted village. At last my patience was rewarded. Half a mile beyond the deserted village, at the bend of a road under the shadow of a windmill, there was presented to my sight what appeared to be a very cosy spot. It was one of those farmhouses which are an exact representation of the cottage that all children are set to draw when they begin their first lesson. This was evidently the miller's house.
An inquiry of a young lady at the house as to whether he might stay for a few days was met with, "Indeed you can, sir." The miller's daughter was Louie Jermey, and thus she entered the legend that was to become Poppyland. Scott stayed his few days, penned his piece for the newspaper, headed it Poppyland, and so began an era which was to change North Norfolk forever, and to be a theme to which Scott would continually return. All the best legends are a mixture of fact and fantasy, and Poppyland is no exception. But some parts of the tale do stand out and have only recently passed from living memory. A short walk from the miller's cottage was a ruined tower where Sidestrand Church once stood. Then the road to the tower was the main road. Today it is a track to the cliff edge, now at its end returned to bushes and brambles. Only the name of the road, Tower Lane, gives the clue to the former destination. The sea continues to gnaw at the cliffs of Norfolk, and in Scott's time most of the cliffs were undefended. 3 years before his visit, St Michael's Church, standing perilously on the cliff tops, had been dismantled, flint by flint, and moved a mile inland to its current site. The crude round tower, built by a local builder in the 1830s to replace the original octagonal tower, had been left on the cliff top. It had served its purpose to hang a bell to call the faithful to worship, but now a fine new tower could be added to the rebuilt church. The round tower now stood as a sea mark, awaiting its inevitable fate. Around it the dead of the village lay in their graves, ready for an undignified tumble down the cliff when the next slip came. To this deserted place came Clement Scott, journalist and writer of popular verse. His first article about Poppyland had already led to several other articles praising North Norfolk, and now he added verses about this garden of sleep.
On the grass of the cliff at the edge of the steep, God planted a garden of sleep. 'Neath the blue of the sky and the green of the corn, it is there that the regal red poppies are born. Brief days of desire and long dreams of delight, they are mine when my Poppyland cometh in sight. In music of distance, with eyes that are wet, it is there I remember, and there I forget. O heart of my heart, where the poppies are born, I am waiting for thee in the hush of the corn. Sleep, sleep, from the cliff to the deep. Sleep, my Poppyland, sleep. In my garden of sleep, where red poppies are spread, I wait for the living alone with the dead. For a tower in ruin stands guard o'er the deep, at whose feet are green graves of dear women asleep. Did they love as I love when they lived by the sea? Did they wait as I wait for the days that may be? Was it hope or fulfilling that entered each breast, ere death gave release and the poppies gave rest? O life of my life on the cliffs by the sea, by the graves in the grass I am waiting for thee. Sleep, sleep, in the dews by the deep. Sleep, my Poppyland, sleep.
Clement Scott's normal environment was Theatreland in London. As the leading theatre critic for the Daily Telegraph, he would be at one of the major London theatres to pen an opening night review, perhaps once or twice a week. He corresponded with and consorted with the leading actor-managers of his day. They were anxious to receive a favourable write-up for their productions. He insisted on his right to be forthright, and he was never short on words. Henry Irving and Ellen Terry at the Lyceum were frequently to receive the benefit of his praise in one of his columns. Other less favourable and strongly expressed opinions led to claim and counterclaim on the letter pages of the national newspapers, and sometimes even reached the libel courts. From the whirl and pressure of London, the constant need to be in print, to earn to support his wife and family of 4, 2 other children died in infancy, Scott found a secret corner of England. He had discovered a spiritual home and a place around which he could weave verse and prose. For he didn't write just for the Telegraph, he also edited the Theatre magazine, contributed to Punch, The Era, and a compendium of other periodicals. Thus we find a variety of stories set in Poppyland. In one, his character meets a new love in a mysterious graveyard. In another, a stirring rescue takes place on the beach at Sidestrand. Now he had created a Poppyland industry, with a book of his pieces from the Telegraph under that name, a book which would go through many editions with commercial publishers and private publication. Who then was Clement William Scott, who'd found himself both a refuge and a source of profitable inspiration in North Norfolk? Most of Scott's papers have now crossed the Atlantic and rest in the library of the University of Rochester in northern New York State. The interested researcher can there begin to piece together the story of his life. It is not the most unnatural of resting places, for Scott did pass nearby on his 1893 journey around the world, when he included Niagara Falls in his itinerary, and wrote a descriptive piece just as effusive and idyllic as that for Poppyland. He was born son of William Scott, Vicar of Hoxton in London. He was educated at Marlborough College, though his school reports don't betray a later literary skill. From Marlborough, he began his working life as a civil servant in the War Office. He was soon contributing to magazines and journals, an enthusiasm he shared with his father. In 1862, he was contracted to the Victoria Press.
Mr. Clement Scott is engaged by Mr. James Ferguson to write the theatre and reviews and other articles from Saturday, the 18th of October, 1862, for the Victoria Press weekly newspaper. Signed, James Ferguson and Clement Scott.
Alas, the Victoria Press was not a successful venture. Without ado, and with the aid of some carefully arranged testimonials, he became a theatre critic for the Sunday Times, where he developed a more florid and expansive style of critical appraisal than had hitherto been the norm. He lost his post at the Sunday Times by being over-enthusiastic for the French theatre. Undeterred, he moved to the Daily Telegraph and would wield great power there for 3 decades as their principal theatre critic and travel writer. Alistair Murphy, curator at Cromer Museum, recalls Scott's first visit to Cromer.
He arrived in 1883, which I think was quite an interesting year worldwide. For instance, Gottlieb Daimler patented the internal combustion engine that year. The Liberal government of Gladstone, which had started so well, had got bogged down at Khartoum. And I always think that around that time, 1883, was probably the height of the British Empire, that there was a decline down towards the First War. So I always think of Scott arriving in Cromer, and Cromer epitomised that kind of confidence that the British Empire had. And I can imagine him arriving, escaping from his dreary, well not dreary, but smoke-ridden life in London, and coming down and being probably slightly patronising towards the people that he saw here.
The theatre was changing and developing in Victorian England. Spectacular productions were in great demand. Scott could be unpopular with audiences because he criticised the then common practice of inappropriate hissing and booing.
My dear Mr. Scott, I, in common with all artists who love fair play, owe you a debt of gratitude for at last taking to task an audience for condemning, without trial, work which, after a patient hearing, might be found not guilty of absolute failure. I would ask you to follow up your just start by crying down, on all occasions, those first-night crawlers. I know that you write in the best interests of our art, and the greatest service you would render it would be to crush out the mischievous demon, the penny first-nighters. Truly yours, Edward Wrighton.
He'd continued in his civil service post until his late 30s, but by then he was earning a full-time living from his writing. He was soon embroiled in disputes because of his forthrightness.
My dear Moy Thomas, I have been compelled to bring a civil action for libel against the referee that had thought fit to print and publish a succession of infamous paragraphs. I trust there is no necessity for me to beg you to believe how entirely innocent I am of such a scandalous transaction as of blackmailing the living or robbing the dead. Yours, Clement Scott.
Shortly before his first visit to North Norfolk, he was at the peak of his powers, and had plays of his own on the London stage. He was both writing plays and translating for others.
My dear Scott, with regard to the French play, I can work only from a literal translation, for as I told you, my knowledge of the French language breaks down after ordering dinner at a Paris restaurant. At any rate, I prefer some other person's translation to my own. When that is done, I try to give an English play in place of a French one, and when I smell a foreign joke, to find a good British substitute. Yours ever, Arthur Pinero.
His correspondence with the actor-managers, the men who staged the plays and appeared in them, could start with disagreement and work to agreement.
Dear Scott, thanks for your note. All's well that ends well. There is no reason why all tastes should not be catered for, the literary, the melodramatic, and even the religious. But here we know we differ. To me, The Village Priest was a very beautiful and noble play. To you, it only presented its seamy side. There is probably justice in both our views. Yours truly, Herbert Beerbone Tree.
He travelled widely around Britain, and a decade later his writings covered a journey around the world.
By great good luck, Niagara conveniently intervenes between Chicago and New York. Thus, in the present year of grace, the cataracts of Niagara become not so much a great sight to be seen as a security to be undertaken. Tea or coffee, sir? The question is asked countless thousands of times all over England. But few at home are aware how very important is the answer to the industrious planter of Ceylon. I venture to think that all-round-the-world travellers make a great mistake who so arrange their programme as to rush too quickly to Japan and consequently leave old China unvisited. Until I visited India, I did not at all understand the artistic beauty of marble. On the stage, I may have heard some mendacious Claude Melnotte gush forth a tirade of mellifluous nonsense about a palace lifting to eternal summer its marble walls.
His inability to appreciate the new drama of Ibsen and Shaw in the last decade of the century led to a final break with the Telegraph.
November the 4th, 1890. Dear Clement Scott, your articles of yesterday and today have given me an idea. Your raps at the new-fangled faddists who tell us we want plays and then give us essays and charades are very timely. Ibsen seems to have sent them crazy, and dramatically, nothing is but what is not, as Macbeth puts it. Passion, heart and soul, must give place to the desultory discussion of questions, the bulk of which most men who think at all have answered for themselves long ago. Wilson Barrett.
In 1899, he took a post for a few months in New York with the New York Herald, a task he tackled with relish.
My dear Seymour, you will see by the enclosed that one is not idle. Here is the result of my work for one Sunday paper. 2 big fat articles. Tomorrow, at the special request of Gordon Bennett, who has cabled over from France, I am to do a series of special articles on the great Molyneux murder trial, the biggest ever known in New York. The case is likely to last 6 weeks. Yours, Clement Scott.
But he was soon back in Britain to found a new penny weekly magazine, The Freelance. He was not a fit man when he returned to Britain, and Scott died in the summer of 1904. At his death, he was laid to rest in the chapel of the Sisters of Nazareth in Southend, an order for which he'd raised funds during his lifetime. Whilst at Cromer, one of his concerns had led him to write to the Catholic bishop in distant Northampton to say that there really ought to be a Roman Catholic church in the town for the benefit of visitors, and in 1896 it was built. His letter can be seen in the hall of the church today. To the last, he'd continued to mention Poppyland in his writings, and it clearly held a special place for him. Where had Scott stood in the world of theatrical criticism? Undoubtedly he was a pioneer of the style which is in use today. In his younger days he was the radical, but in older and crustier years he didn't take kindly to the new and more direct style of writing, nor did he write one sentence when 3 would do. By the time Ibsen was writing, Scott was describing his play Ghosts as a loathsome sore unbandaged, an open drain, a dirty act done publicly, and a laser house with all its doors and windows open. Naturally, then, Scott made both friends and enemies. Alistair Murphy.
Opinions of Scott are varied. Here's a review by Max Beerbohm of Scott's work, And he quotes at the beginning of an article entitled An Unhappy Poet, he quotes one of Scott's poems. Bexhill-on-Sea is the haven for me, wherever my nerves are depressed, for there's a retreat where you golf and you eat, and you sleep and you dream and you rest. And he goes on to say, these exquisite words were written by one of the most prolific, and it may be most popular of our modern poets, Mr. Clement Scott. We quote them not merely because their cadence has haunted us, and it is a pleasure to write them out, but also because they seem to epitomise the bitter tragedy of their writer's life.
The Bancrofts, Squire and Marie, actor-managers of the Prince of Wales Theatre, were amongst his friends. Scott helped adapt a French play for them with the English title of Diplomacy, and another entitled Peril would bring him income over many years. Wilson Barrett of the Prince's Theatre, Herbert Beerbohm Tree, who built Her Majesty's, and George Alexander of St James's Theatre all received Scott's praise in his columns. Ellen Terry, the leading actress of the age, was amongst his favourites. Henry Irving played the great Shakespeare roles, and later became the first British actor to be knighted. He too frequently received praise from Scott. Others regarded him as a man of lightweight taste, carried away with Victorian verbosity and melodramatic style. George Bernard Shaw was one such, taking his animosity to the point of writing a play entitled Widowers' Houses, pointedly aimed at Scott. Others mocked in a less direct way. The renowned poet Algernon Swinburne, together with his great friend Theodore Watts, came to discover Poppyland for themselves. Whilst arriving with scepticism, they were undoubtedly taken by the same stark and poppy-crowded landscape as Scott, and Swinburne celebrated it in his own verse.
Heart handfast in heart as they stood, look thither. Did he whisper, look forth from the flowers to the sea? For the foam flowers endure where the rose blossoms wither, and men that love lightly may die, but we? And the same wind sang, and the same waves whitened, and forever the garden's last petals were shed, in the lips that had whispered, the eyes that had lightened, love was dead. Or they loved their life through, and then went with her, and were one to the end, but what end who knows? Love deep as the sea, as a rose must wither, as the rose-red seaweed that mocks the rose. Shall the dead take thought for the dead to love them? What love was ever as deep as a grave? They are loveless now as the grass above them, or the wave. All are at one now, roses and lovers, not known of the cliffs and the fields and the sea. Not a breath of the time that has been hovers in the air now soft with the summer to be. Not a breath shall there sweeten the seasons hereafter, of the flowers or the lovers that laugh now or weep, when as they that are free now of weeping and laughter, we shall sleep.
George R. Sims, writer, reviewer and social reformer and practical joker, was another of those who came to see for himself. Louie and Poppyland Cottage regularly featured in his writings. One day he put it about that he was a lunatic and that his companion, Henry Pettit, was his keeper. They roamed around Overstrand, terrifying the residents. On another occasion he arrived at the Mill Cottage and bought all the homemade blackberry jam, so there was none when Scott arrived. Ghostly rattling and murderous cries around the lanes of the village could usually be ascribed to Sims and his cronies. But many of Scott's friends and contemporaries came simply to enjoy the area, and found it as restful and enchanting as he'd suggested. Wilson Barrett wrote from the Mill House.
Poppyland, July 25th, 1886. Sims tells me you're off to Switzerland. Have you abandoned the piece? I suppose you've not had time to send me the scenarios you promised. We are most comfortable here. The people are very kind, the place pretty, and the house, as you know, beautifully clean. We are hard at work, and the place right to inspire us. I asked a Norfolk friend to find me lodgings on the coast, and of all the places in the world he took on this. Of course, I was pleased to get it, and I am sure I shall not regret it. You are quite the patron saint of the district. Send me a few lines before you leave. Yours always, Wilson Barrett.
Sir George Alexander wrote from Acton Villa in West Ranton, and Squire Bancroft and his wife Marie, both considerable correspondents with Scott, would soon be writing from the Lynx Hotel at Cromer. So they came, famous and bit-part players, the established and the hopeful, the rich and the ambitious, to see this Poppyland of which Scott wrote in the London papers. And as planned by the railway company when they had asked Scott to come, the people came. Families dressed splendidly for their beach parties, paraded on the prom, and hired the bathing machines. The fishermen benefited by adding boat excursions to their principal income. The lifeboat crew enjoyed demonstrating their expertise, and the beaches of North Norfolk buzzed with the excitement of seaside holidays. Plans were soon afoot for another station to serve excursionists from the East Midlands.
Over that period, just prior to him arriving in 77, the railway first arrived. And then after he'd been in 83, the railway actually came into the centre of town in 1887. And I think with the railway arriving, Clement Scott promoting Poppyland as a brand name almost, it was uphill all the way for Cromer, and most of the major development took place after the 1887 railway station opened, the beach station, the existing station now. And between 1887 and 97, all of, particularly the west side of Cromer, was transformed into this huge Victorian holiday resort with big hotels and boarding houses. I don't know what the ordinary Cromer person who'd been born in 1850 would have thought of all this. I suspect not an awful lot, and would have complained about incomers, just as people are prone to do these days.
The local landowners made their plans for the development of their land. Lawyer, Member of Parliament and local philanthropist Benjamin Bond Cabell marked out his land to the west of Cromer for development, and whilst he died before seeing it come to fruition, the regular grid of that part of Cromer shows his planning. In Overstrand itself, Lord and Lady Battersea planned the development of their modest cottage, the Pleasance. Architect Edwin Lutyens laid out for them the design of a grand house which would include a Japanese room and Japanese gardens. Lutyens would contribute several other buildings to the village, including the Methodist Chapel, before going on to make his mark in many other parts of the country and further afield, notably the city of New Delhi. Before long, Overstrand had acquired a new name, the Village of Millionaires. Lord Wolverhampton built Carwood House. Actor Sir John Hare, a great friend of Clement Scott, had the Grange built, before Mr. Player of cigarette fame took it on. Sir Edgar Speyer built Seamarge, and Winston Churchill is reputed to have borrowed the telephone there to mobilise the fleet for the First World War. Sir Edgar himself was later ejected from the country as an alien. Macmillan, the publishing family, owned Meadow Cottage. With the private residences came the hotels to cater for the short-term visitors. Sheringham and Cromer owe their great hotels, now mostly gone, to this period. The Grand stood imperiously over the West Cliffs in Cromer. Designed by noted Norwich architect George Skipper, it catered for the rich and famous, going into gentle decline after the Second World War and succumbing to fire in the 1960s. The modest Hôtel de Paris, once Lord Suffield's summer residence, was greatly enhanced by Skipper. He took the basic structure, together with two small neighbouring hotels, and refaced them with an elegant Victorian frontage and distinctive copper dome. The Cliftonville Hotel was originally a modest symmetrical development by owner William Churchyard, but Skipper was engaged to add a more flamboyant frontage on the Runton Road. In Munsley, the Royal Hotel and the now so sad Continental Hotel are examples of brash speculation from the Poppyland age. It may one day join the Overstrand Hotel, itself devastated by fire, and then to tumble ungraciously to the beach in yet another slip of the land. So, through the final decades of the 19th century, the billboards at London's Liverpool Street Station proclaimed the benefits of a visit to Cromer and Overstrand, to Poppyland and the Garden of Sleep. And the entrepreneurs of Cromer were quick to respond to the opportunities offered as the visitors arrived.
Clement Scott invented the idea of Poppyland in his writings, and the local businesses were not slow to pick up on that idea. And we have in the museum here Poppyland China, Poppyland Souvenirs. We've got this very nice railway poster from Edwardian times that is still selling, even 20 years later, is still selling this image of Poppyland.
Daniel Davison, chemist and latterly council chairman, saw an opportunity, and a mix of perfumes was quickly labelled and packaged under the name Poppyland Bouquet. Local companies Jarrold's, Bertram Watts and Rounce and Wortley's all added Poppyland China to the ranges they carried in their shops. The original poem of the Garden of Sleep took on a further life as the words were given music by a popular Victorian composer.
Isidora de Lara put to music the poem of Clement Scott, which was a famous song around the turn of the century. In fact, I had somebody come into the museum a few years ago who was sung the song by their grandfather or grandmother.
On the grass of the cliff, at the edge of the steep, God planted a garden of sleep. 'Neath the blue of the sky, in the green of the corn, it is there that the regal red poppies are born. Brief days of desire and long dreams of delight, they are mine when my Poppyland cometh in sight. O heart of my heart, where the poppies are born, I am waiting for thee in the hush of the corn. O heart of my heart, where the poppies are born, I am waiting for thee in the hush of the corn. In my garden of sleep,
Postcards of Poppyland proliferated. The Miller and Louie Jermey were featured on cards, and fields of poppies appeared on others. A favourite was the mysterious tower itself in the Garden of Sleep. Sometimes the tower stood alone on the card, sometimes the words of Scott's verse were added. Sometimes the tower moved. It can still be found labelled as Cromer, Sheringham, Overstrand, as well as correctly at Side Strand. Even a model of the tower appeared as a souvenir. Just as today our magazines send their writers to dip in and out of such stories, so then, the Ladies' Pictorial dispatched Mrs. Alfred Berlin, and her pieces were later reproduced in Vera in Poppyland. There's not a little humour in the book, gently sending up the story. She's much taken with the thought as to whether the local rhyme, Trimmingham, Gimmingham, Knapton and Trunch, Southreps and Northreps lie all of a bunch, was written by Scott or Swinburne. Clement Scott, of course, made the most of the publication and republication of his articles. The publishers Jarrold's took up the rights for a while, and then Scott took them back himself. On his death, his home was reported to be well stocked with books that he'd published to keep his market going. By the time of his death, he'd written of his regret at the development his words had led to.
The Cromer that we visit now is not the Cromer I wrote about but a few short years ago as my beloved Poppyland. As I look from the station hill, I see the intervening space between railway and cliff cut up into building plots, and the lighthouse hill threatened by the speculative contractor. Overstrand, once a picturesque collection of farmhouses and fishermen's cottages, is now a pretty colony of red brick houses, as smart as Bedford Park.
In other quotations, he's still more disparaging, referring to bungalow land. The town council at Cromer was also in two minds about Scott. When the question of recognition for Scott came up, several wanted no memorial to the man who'd so changed their select town. Others felt it was ungracious not to recognise him, and the matter was settled when it was learnt that the memorial was already on its way to Cromer, in the form of the horse-drinking trough, the fountain that stands today on the road to Overstrand. What of Louie Jermey, the maid of the mill? Hostess from the age of 19 to the famous from the literary and theatrical world, her Mr. Scott continued to call for several years. Visitors wrote of her as living in a world borrowed from other minds, married to her imaginations and her associations. With the death of her father, the hostess had to give up the mill house, her home since childhood, and she moved to a cottage in Tower Lane. In 1919, George Sims was one of the last of the original group to visit.
So snaps another link with the pleasant and picturesque past. Miss Jermey should write her reminiscences. She has been the guardian home-from-home angel of famous men.
Louie had been a celebrity in herself, and was now to follow that path followed by many such who find that their name and reputation is slipping from the consciousness of others. She was able to retain some of the cuttings and memorabilia from her famous days, but was robbed of more of these through a fire in her home in 1924. She remained a local celebrity to the end of her days. Bert Vincent recalls.
Well, I'm standing in Tower Lane, where Louie Jermey came to in her later life. And I met Louie Jermey when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I was at some sort of garden fete in Overstrand, and my father said to me, "Oh, come and meet Louie Jermey, she's quite a famous person." Well, I'd have far rather been having a go on a coconut shy, but I went over and met her. She was obviously a little old lady, it seemed to me, but of course at that age they're all little old ladies, but she was accompanied by another lady, arm in arm with her, and when I went to speak to her, there was something rather special about her. I don't know what it was, but there must have been something rather different, because I've remembered it even to this day. But certainly in that time there was just that little bit about her that made me remember her, even at 9 years old.
Towards the end, she would sell flowers and herbs from door to door, pushing an old battered pram. She needed but the slightest encouragement to talk of the excitement of her days of fame. Finally, she was laid to rest in the graveyard of the new Garden of Sleep, in a corner of the churchyard of St. Michael's, then 50 years on from its move from the cliff top. No one had seen the old tower fall in the winter of 1916. One day it was there, the next 2 villagers walked home to Sidestrand to report that it was no more. The cliff had slipped again. Today it's been followed by Louie's Tower Lane cottage, and several others besides.
I had a cousin who lived here at the end of Tower Lane. It was a lovely spot, and we used to go and visit her, and then it got, of course, very close to the edge of the cliff, and finally, of course, they had to abandon it, and it has since gone over the cliff.
A walk along the beach to the east of Overstrand will provide the evidence. Amongst the ancient flints and the variety of stones brought to Norfolk in the Ice Ages are the unmistakable signs of former homes. Soft Norfolk red bricks, some still cemented together, lie in the rock pools, and occasionally a tile from the church floor or a sliver from a roof tile can be found.
It has passed to the deep with its poppies of red. Away on the cliffs desolation is spread, for the towering ruins that guarded their sleep has passed with the poppies away to the deep. I sigh as I look far away o'er the sea, and I think of the day that, alas, ne'er can be.
But there is an epilogue. In 1983, some 100 people joined the Poppyland Centenary Walk along the cliff top from Cromer to Overstrand and Sidestrand. Gerald celebrated its part in the story through its shop window display. By a stroke of fate, the owners of Mill House were most interested in the story, and the brother of one of the owners, Richard Brooke, was a producer with the BBC. Soon filming was underway. A new tower in its Garden of Sleep was built on the cliff top. Shakespearean actor Alan Howard was cast as Clement Scott, and Phoebe Nichols played the part of Louie Jermey. Nat Crosby, later himself to retire to Poppyland, framed the elegant images for the camera. Bathing machines reappeared on Cromer Beach. The skyline appeared much as it was in Scott's day. The story came to life on screen on a Sunday evening in the spring of 1985, and a modern-day critic described the production as the year's delight. This film might do for Poppyland what the Victorian Trendies did all over again. Clement Scott has faded into the background of theatre history, though our modern method of criticism of literature, films and plays has passed down from him. The last links with the Maid of the Mill are vanishing. Many of the hotels have gone, and other buildings of the 1890s need much loving care and attention. But there is much of Poppyland to enjoy by a far greater audience. The natural beauty of the whole of the North Norfolk coast, the summer sunrise and sunset over the sea, the fishing boats in the early morning, and occasionally the poppies bursting through as long quiet earth is turned over. In the annals of theatre history, Clement Scott has proved to have a minor part. Frankly, he backed the wrong side. It was to be Ibsen and Shaw that would stand the test of time. Nevertheless, as we've said, the bite of the modern theatre critic owes a debt to Scott. The sharpness, immediacy and power of the film reviewer and the first-night theatre critic are founded on the opinionated approach that Scott took. North Norfolk today also owes a debt to Scott. We celebrate the heritage of Victorian and Edwardian Cromer and Sheringham, Overstrand and Sidestrand. The film crews continue to arrive. The theatre at the end of the pier buzzes with life, and it's no idle statement to say that the pier would probably not have even been built except for that remarkable period of investment brought on by Scott. Overstrand and Sidestrand continue to offer a quality of life envied by many a city dweller. New roads take much of the traffic past Overstrand, and the quiet lanes and cliff-top walks are a constant pleasure. A corner of a quiet churchyard at Sidestrand is the resting place for a family caught up in a legend. A museum houses many reminders of Clement Scott and the Maid of the Mill. And the very buildings of Poppyland themselves mix with the fields, the cliffs and the sea to recall times gone by.